Blood was everywhere. I lay on the cold ground, my vision blurring. Not far away, Alex Stewart lay in a pool of blood, his deep gaze frozen in space. The woman he had died protecting was now hiding behind James Wilson, her eyes devoid of any sorrow. Alex. I'm sorry. I used my last ounce of strength to crawl toward him. Since childhood, I had silently protected him, yet could never win his heart. Even in my final moment, I chose to take the bullet meant for him. As consciousness faded, I thought I heard sirens in the distance. But it was too late. Miss Chen? Miss Chen. A familiar voice jolted me awake. I opened my eyes to find myself sitting in my favorite wicker chair in the Stewart mansion's garden, surrounded by blooming roses. I still held my copy of Gone with the Wind in my hands. Mr. Thompson, the old butler, was looking at me with concern. Miss Chen, did you fall asleep? It's quite warm today. I stared at my hands in disbelief. No blood, no wounds. My phone showed the date, May 15th, 2023, exactly 2 months before Alex would meet Victoria. I had really been reborn. Miss Chen, Mr. Stewart just finished his meeting. He'd like to have dinner with you. Mr. Thompson's words made my heart race. Alex, he was alive. I stood up, smoothing my white summer dress, a birthday gift from Alex last year. He said white suited me. But back then, his eyes held only friendly affection. Walking through the corridor, I caught my reflection in the window. 24 years old, with dark hair and clear eyes, and that hint of determination hidden in their depths. In my previous life, I didn't know how to seize my chances, content to love him silently from the shadows. But this time, I would grasp this second chance that fate had given me. Grace. I turned at the familiar voice. Alex strode toward me, as handsome as ever in his tailored suit, with slightly messy short hair and those eyes that always held a hint of warmth. Rough day? I asked gently, just as I had countless times before. Alex loosened his tie, draping it casually over his jacket. Just the usual board meetings. His gaze fell on my book. Reading Gone with the Wind again? How many times is this? 7th time. I smiled, my mind already planning how to broach the subject. Alex shook his head indulgently. You and your romantic tragedies. He paused. By the way, there's a charity gala next week. Would you be my +1? That gala, in my previous life, it was where he met Victoria. I looked directly into his eyes and gathered my courage. Of course. But there's something I need to tell you first. Oh. Alex raised an eyebrow in surprise. He knew me too well, knew I was rarely this serious. The setting sun cast a golden glow on his profile. In that moment, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. After 15 years of silent love and 2 lifetimes of protection, it was enough. Alex, I love you. Not as a friend, but as someone who wants to be with you. The corridor fell silent, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. This time, I would change everything. Alex froze. The sunset cast shifting shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. The silence felt like an eternity. I forced myself to maintain a smile, though my palms were growing damp. If I had known it would be this difficult, perhaps I should have chosen a better moment. What did you say? He asked, his voice hoarse. I said I love you. This time my voice was surprisingly steady. Since that day when you chased away those bullies at school when we were 15, or maybe even earlier when we used to sneak out to watch the sunset together. That's when I fell in love with you. Alex stared at me intently, his gaze so intense it was almost unbearable. He stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Why are you only telling me this now? I stepped back, leaning against the corridor railing. Because I was afraid of losing you as a friend. So you would rather watch me be with someone else? His voice suddenly took on a dangerous edge. I had never seen Alex like this before. He loomed in the twilight like a predator ready to pounce. Wait, what did he say? With someone else? In my previous life, he hadn't met Victoria at this point. Before I could process this, Alex had already placed one hand on the railing behind me, using the other to lift my chin. Tell me, Grace, did you really think I only saw you as a sister? I widened my eyes, my heart racing even faster. Why do you think I always wanted you by my side at every event? Why do you think I glared at every man in the company who showed interest in you? Why do you think I ignored all those socialites and spent every weekend with you? His voice grew lower, almost grinding between his teeth. Do you know how many blind dates I've turned down over the years? Every time my mother asked, I told her I had someone I loved. Do you know who that was? I shook my head numbly. The Alex from my previous life had never said these things to me. It was you, silly. He suddenly smiled, showing that familiar gentle expression I knew so well. But you always treated me like a brother, and I was afraid I'd scare you away if I said anything. My eyes suddenly welled up with tears. So in our previous life, We had both been testing the waters, missing our best chance. If I hadn't been reborn, if I hadn't found the courage. Don't cry. Alex gently wiped away my tears. Now that you've finally said it, don't think you can escape. His kiss landed softly on my forehead, like a solemn promise. Grace Chen, from today on, you're mine. If anyone dares to bully you, they'll have to answer to me. That familiar possessive tone. Once he had protected Victoria this way, but now, that possessiveness was all mine. We heard Mr. Thompson's footsteps in the distance, but Alex showed no intention of letting me go. His eyes held a playful glint. What's wrong? Feeling shy. You, let go first. I pushed against his chest, my face burning. No, he held me even tighter. I've waited too long for this day. Now that you've finally confessed, how could I possibly let you go? As the sun set, the scent of roses wafted through the garden. At that moment, I felt like the happiest woman in the world. But I knew this happiness hadn't come easily. In 2 months, the woman who had once broken Alex's heart would appear. This time, I would protect my happiness. The following days, Alex seemed determined to make up for all the tenderness he hadn't shown me over the years. In the mornings, when he sent me to work, he would seriously instruct his driver. Drive carefully, my girlfriend gets carsick. At lunch, he would personally pick me up, no matter how busy he was. He never let me handle those business lunches alone, knowing how much I disliked networking. In the evenings, he insisted on driving me home, waiting until I disappeared into the elevator before leaving. Mr. Stewart, won't all this time spent with Miss Chen affect your work? One day, I overheard his assistant asking cautiously, "What's more important, work or my girlfriend?" He replied without looking up, his tone brooking no argument. The assistant wisely fell silent. Days passed quickly, and soon it was time for the charity gala. I wore a light blue backless dress that Alex had personally chosen, saying it complemented my skin tone. As soon as we entered the ballroom, I heard the whispers start. Isn't that the Stewart heir? And that's. I heard they grew up together. So they finally got together? What a shame. I was hoping to introduce my daughter to Mr. Stewart. Alex tightened his arm around my waist, his cold gaze sweeping across the gossiping crowd. The voices immediately died down. Just then, a striking figure approached us. My heart skipped a beat. It was Victoria Reed. She wore a stunning red dress, looking absolutely radiant. It was the same dress she'd worn when she first met Alex in my previous life. How could I forget? Mr. Stewart. She approached with a champagne glass, her gaze fixed on Alex. I'm Victoria Reed, daughter of Reed Group's CEO. In my previous life, Alex had fallen for her at this moment. But this time, I apologize, Alex didn't even look at her, but my fiancé and I have an appointment with the Lin Corp representatives. He naturally took my hand, ready to leave. Fiancé. Victoria's voice was filled with shock. I turned my head, meeting her gaze. In those beautiful eyes, I saw a familiar flash of emotions. Disbelief, anger, and pain. Wait, that expression. A terrible suspicion formed in my mind. Had she been reborn too? Suddenly, Victoria's champagne glass tilted, red wine spilling toward my dress. Alex quickly pulled me behind him, the wine splashing onto his suit instead. I'm so sorry. Victoria immediately acted flustered. I didn't mean to. It's fine, Alex's voice was ice cold, but Miss Reed, I suggest you be more careful. These accidents shouldn't happen twice. He then took off his jacket, draped it over my shoulders, and led me away without a backward glance. As we passed Victoria, I clearly heard her whisper, Grace, you'd better watch out. Some things aren't yours to keep just because you got there first. So I was right. She had been reborn too. But Victoria, this time I won't let you succeed. This life, you'll pay double for all the mistakes you made in our last one. On the drive home, Alex said suddenly, Grace, I need to go to Boston for a week on business. My heart tightened. In my previous life, this business trip was when Victoria had started getting close to him. She had deliberately orchestrated chance encounters in Boston, even pretending to be injured to gain his attention and care. Alex, I said softly, could I come with you? What about your work? He glanced at me. The office isn't too busy right now. I can take a few days off, I held his hand. Besides, I'll miss you. That was the truth. The pain from my previous life made me want to stay by his side every moment. I still remembered how Victoria had gradually manipulated him until he became nothing but her puppet. Alex gave me an indulgent smile. Silly girl, it's just a week. He paused. But if you want to come, let's go together. You can meet our Boston partners while we're there. As the car drove smoothly through the night, I leaned on his shoulder, memories of my past life flooding back. Back then, Alex had been a brilliant business prodigy, tripling Stewart Enterprises' market value by age 28. People knew him as ruthless in business, but never saw how gentle he could be with those he cared about. Unfortunately, Victoria had exploited that gentleness completely. I still remembered how after this Boston trip in my previous life, Alex had changed entirely. He began dating Victoria frequently, introducing her to his family. I had been naive enough to feel happy for him, thinking he'd finally found true love. "What are you thinking about?" Alex's voice broke through my thoughts. I shook my head. "Nothing, just thinking how perfect everything is right now." "Silly," he ruffled my hair. "Things will only get better from here." If only he knew what had happened in my previous life. How Victoria had planted seeds of obsession in his heart, how she had used his hatred for James Wilson to gradually push him toward destruction. James Wilson. The name alone made my blood run cold. He was Alex's biggest business rival and the man who had killed him in my previous life. But before that, he had been Victoria's most closely guarded secret. I remembered Alex saying his feud with Wilson went back 5 years. Wilson had sabotaged a crucial contract to damage Stewart Enterprises, causing Alex's grandfather to have a stroke. Alex had sworn to make him pay for his underhanded tactics, and Victoria had exploited that hatred perfectly. She pretended to be harassed by Wilson to gain Alex's sympathy and protection. After Alex fell for her, she constantly manipulated him into confrontations with Wilson. "Do you remember Victoria Reed from the gala?" I asked carefully. Alex frowned. "Why bring her up?" "I just felt something off about the way she looked at you." "Forget about her," Alex said firmly. "You're the only one I want, in this life and always." In this life. In my previous life, I had only discovered at the moment of death that Victoria and James Wilson had been together all along. She had approached Alex solely to help Wilson's revenge. She had calculatingly married Alex, then flaunted her relationship with Wilson in front of him. When Alex was at his lowest, she had pretended to be threatened by Wilson. Finally, Alex had fallen into their trap trying to protect his endangered wife. "Grace." Alex noticed my distraction, concern in his voice. "What's wrong? You seem distant today." I forced a smile. "Just tired, maybe." Of course I was tired, remembering everything from my past life. But in this life, I swore to protect this man. Even if Victoria had been reborn too, I wouldn't let tragedy repeat itself. "Alex, this time it's my turn to protect you." "By the way," Alex suddenly said, "it's my mother's birthday next week. She specifically asked to see you." My heart skipped a beat. At this point in my previous life, the Stewarts had already been investigating Victoria's background. "Your mother wants to see me?" I looked up at Alex. In my previous life at this time, he had just met Victoria, and Mrs. Stewart had already started arranging their marriage. "Yes," Alex gripped the steering wheel tighter. She said, "She wants to discuss our wedding plans." I froze. Wedding plans? We'd only been together for such a short time. Seeing my hesitation, Alex chuckled. "Having second thoughts?" "I can call my mom right now and tell her you're not ready." "No." I grabbed his arm without thinking. "I want to." "Of course I want to." The amusement in Alex's eyes deepened. "That eager?" I released his arm, blushing. "You know how long I've waited." The car stopped at a red light, and Alex leaned over to place a gentle kiss on my forehead. "I've been waiting a long time too, Grace." That tender kiss reminded me of the final scene from my previous life. Back then, Alex had looked at Victoria with the same tenderness, willing to sacrifice his life to protect her even knowing she had betrayed him. Later that night at home, I tossed and turned in bed. Suddenly, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "You think being reborn once can change anything?" My heart jumped. "Victoria." Another message followed. "He will fall in love with me eventually. Because I understand him better than you do." "Grace, how do you think Alex would feel if he knew how you've been manipulating him?" I laughed coldly. "Manipulation? How dare she, after how she had exploited Alex's trust in our previous life, step by step leading him to his destruction? If anyone was guilty of manipulation, it was her." "Miss Reed," I typed quickly, "are you sure you want to play this game? Don't forget, I remember everything from our previous life too. Including your relationship with James Wilson, including how you both killed Alex. What do you think would happen if I told him everything?" There was a long pause before she replied, "You really think he'd believe you?" "Grace, you're so naive." Just then, I received a message from Alex. "Still awake?" "Yes, thinking about you," I replied. "Silly girl." He seemed to see through my worries even through the screen. "Stop overthinking and get some rest. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning for work." Looking at Alex's message, I suddenly had an idea. "Miss Reed," I replied to that number. "You're right, I am naive. But do you know what Alex hates most? He hates being played for a fool. This time, I won't give you a chance to get close to him. Because before you can even start your games, I'll make sure he sees your true colors." After sending this message, I blocked the number. Lying in bed, I began planning my next moves. I needed to make Alex wary of Victoria before she could make her move. And the best way to do that was through James Wilson. I clearly remembered that Victoria and James had met 5 years ago in my previous life. Back then, Wilson wasn't yet Stewart Enterprises' archenemy. They had met at a charity event. By my calculations, Victoria and James should already be together now. If that's the case, I picked up my phone and sent Alex a message. Darling, I think I have a good idea about how to deal with James Wilson. The next morning, Alex arrived right on time to pick me up. So, what's this idea you mentioned last night? He asked while driving. I knew that any mention of James Wilson would instantly grab his attention. Do you remember Victoria Reed from the gala? I asked casually. I've heard she has quite a special relationship with James Wilson. Alex's brows furrowed. You mean? Yes, I nodded, pulling out my phone. I had someone look into it. Last year, Wilson had a private villa in Miami Beach. Victoria was a frequent visitor. And I showed him a photo that my private investigator had found. It showed Wilson with his arm around Victoria's waist, the two looking intimate on a yacht. When was this taken? Alex's voice turned cold. 3 months ago, I said softly. That's why I felt something was off when she approached you at the gala. Alex's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. Was she trying to use me, thinking I wouldn't know about her connection to Wilson? I remained silent, watching him. Some realizations were more effective when he reached them himself. Grace, he suddenly spoke, his voice tinged with apology. I'm sorry for making you worry about these things. I looked at him surprised. Why are you apologizing? Because, he sighed, I know you don't like getting involved in business politics. But you still did it for me. Silly, I reached for his hand. I did it because I love you. I can't bear to see anyone trying to hurt you. Alex's gaze softened. Meeting you is the best thing that's ever happened to me. My heart warmed, though tinged with pain. In my previous life, Alex had been too trusting, which led him straight into Victoria's trap. This time, I needed to teach him to be more cautious. When we arrived at the office, Alex suddenly said, Wilson is working on a big project right now. He's trying to acquire a tech company in Boston. I immediately understood his meaning. Do you need me to look into anything? No, he shook his head. What you've confirmed is enough. He took out his phone and dialed a number. Charlie, I need you to check Victoria Reed's travel records for the past 2 years, especially anything connected to James Wilson. After hanging up, Alex's eyes turned sharp. If they want to play games, I'll play along. Watching his expression, I suddenly remembered something. Aren't we going to Boston tomorrow? Yes, why? I found out Wilson's also in Boston right now, apparently for that tech company acquisition. I paused. And Victoria's there too. Alex gave a cold laugh. Looks like they're setting up something in Boston. Fine, let's see what kind of game they're playing. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. Mr. Stewart, we've confirmed that Victoria Reed invested in several tech companies in Boston last year. All of them have close ties to James Wilson. Alex and I exchanged looks. So they had planned this. This Boston trip just got interesting. Alex's tone was icy. Though I'm curious about one thing. What? How did you know to investigate Victoria? He looked at me thoughtfully. You're not usually this vigilant about business matters. My heart tightened. How should I answer this question? I took a deep breath, deciding to tell a partial truth. Do you remember when we were 18? Alex looked surprised. Why bring that up now? That year, when my father and I went bankrupt, we were betrayed by many so-called friends. I gazed out the window, my voice tinged with bitterness. Since then, I learned that some people who appear friendly are actually plotting against you. So when I saw the way Victoria looked at you at the gala, something felt wrong. Alex's expression darkened at the mention of that year. Back then, Chen Industries had been sabotaged, going bankrupt overnight. My father had suffered a heart attack from the shock and was hospitalized. Alex had stayed by my side through it all, even convincing his grandfather to invest in our company, saving it from collapse. Silly girl, Alex stroked my hair. Don't worry. As long as I'm here, no one will ever hurt you again. I leaned against his shoulder, thinking about my previous life. Back then, Alex had been completely infatuated with Victoria, even cutting ties with his family for her sake. Meanwhile, Victoria had targeted me repeatedly, trying everything to force me out of Stewart Enterprises. If it hadn't been for my father's debt of gratitude to the Stewarts, I probably wouldn't have even kept my job. By the way, Alex suddenly said, since we know they're setting something up in Boston, should we? Let's not tip our hand yet, I interrupted. Let them reveal their cards first. Then, before I could finish, Alex's phone rang. It was his mother. Mom. Alex answered. Mrs. Stewart's warm voice came through the speaker. Alex, dear, bring Grace home for dinner tonight. I've had the kitchen prepare her favorite truffle risotto. Alex glanced at me. We'll definitely be there on time. After he hung up, I felt anxious. In my previous life at this time, Mrs. Stewart had just started looking for potential matches for Alex. Even though we were together now, I wondered if she would. What are you thinking about? Alex quickly noticed my unease. My mom adores you. Don't you remember how she always used to say she wished she could have a daughter-in-law just like you? Yes, I remembered. But hadn't Mrs. Stewart been completely won over by Victoria's sweet talk in my previous life? Back then, Victoria had Mrs. Stewart wrapped around her finger. Alex, I suddenly spoke up. Do you think your mother might think we're moving too fast? He laughed. Too fast? We've known each other for 20 years, grown up together. Isn't that long enough? I shook my head. But, no buts, he said seriously. I've already told my mom that it's you or no one. Looking at Alex's determined expression, I felt warmth spread through my chest. But just then my phone vibrated. It was a picture message from an unknown number. When I opened it, my face went pale. It was a photo of Alex and me talking in his car, taken from an angle that made it look inappropriately intimate. A text followed. Miss Chen, what do you think Mrs. Stewart would say if she saw this photo? Even though your love is real, photos like this can easily be misinterpreted by elders. It was Victoria. But what shocked me more was how did she know I was going to the Stewarts tonight? Unless she had someone on the inside of the Stewart household. I forced myself to stay calm. In my previous life, Victoria had used this same trick, first showing Mrs. Stewart candid photos of her chance meetings with Alex, then appearing as a victim to win Mrs. Stewart's sympathy. This time, I wouldn't let her repeat that strategy. What's wrong? Alex noticed my change in expression and leaned over to look at my phone. I quickly turned off the screen. Nothing, just a work email. Alex looked at me suspiciously. You don't look well. Maybe I'm just nervous. I forced a smile about seeing your mother tonight. Silly, he affectionately ruffled my hair. What's there to be nervous about? After Alex left for his meeting, I immediately replied to that number. Miss Reed, do you really think Mrs. Stewart would believe such photos? Don't forget, I've known the Stewart family for 20 years. She replied quickly, exactly because you've known them for 20 years, wouldn't Mrs. Stewart be even more disappointed? A childhood friend, behaving so inappropriately. Miss Chen, what do you think that would do to her opinion of you? I laughed coldly, feel free to try. But Miss Reed, are you really so confident you can repeat your old tricks? She sent back a laughing emoji. We'll see. By the way, I hear Boston's weather is lovely this time of year, perfect for a chance encounter. So she was planning to make her move in Boston. Taking a deep breath, I typed quickly. Victoria, you think I don't know your plan? That tech company in Boston is a trap set by you and James Wilson. You're planning to get Alex to invest, and then... After sending this message, I immediately switched to my other phone and texted my private investigator. Keep close watch on Victoria Reed and James Wilson's activities in Boston, especially their connections to the tech company. Also, look into any unusual behavior among the Stewart household staff. That evening, Alex picked me up for dinner at his family's house. During the drive, he kept talking about our childhood memories, apparently trying to ease my nervousness. But he didn't know that my anxiety had nothing to do with meeting his mother. Grace. Just before we arrived, he suddenly said, actually, my mother wants to give you my grandmother's sapphire necklace today. I froze. What? It's a Stewart family heirloom. Before she passed away, my grandmother said it should go to my future wife, Alex said softly. My mother is officially accepting you as her daughter-in-law. My eyes welled up with tears. In my previous life, that necklace had ended up around Victoria's neck. And now, Alex, I gripped his hand tightly. Promise me something. No matter what happens, always trust me, okay? He gave me a puzzled look. Silly girl, what are you talking about? Of course I trust you. Just then my phone vibrated. It was a message from my investigator. Miss Chen, we found that the new housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, has connections to the Reed family. Just as I thought. Looks like tonight's going to be interesting. The gates of the Stewart mansion slowly opened, and I saw a figure watching from the doorway. It was the new housekeeper, Mrs. Parker. She wore a respectful smile, but couldn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes. Mr. Stewart, Miss Chen. Mrs. Parker stepped forward. Mrs. Stewart is waiting in the dining room. I noticed her discreetly touching the phone in her apron pocket while speaking. Thank you. I held onto Alex's arm, deliberately slowing our pace. As expected, Mrs. Parker immediately excused herself to the kitchen, hurrying away. What's wrong? Alex sensed my unease. I shook my head. Nothing, just that Mrs. Parker seems unfamiliar. Oh, she started last week, Alex said casually. I heard she's some distant relative of Mr. Thompson's. I inwardly smirked. Distant relative? Victoria was certainly thorough in her planning. In the dining room, Mrs. Stewart was arranging flowers. Seeing us enter, she immediately put down her flowers. "Grace, darling." "Mrs. Stewart," I greeted sweetly. Mrs. Stewart took my hands, looking me up and down. "You've lost weight. Are you working too hard at the office? Alex, you should take better care of her." Alex smiled helplessly. "Mom, I drive her to and from work every day. How is that not taking care of her?" "Well, that's more like it." Mrs. Stewart nodded approvingly, then said mysteriously, "Grace, I have something to give you." Just then Mrs. Parker rushed in frantically. "Mrs. Stewart, there's a problem." "What is it?" Mrs. Stewart frowned. The kitchen. The heat was too high. The truffle risotto might be burned." "Oh dear." Mrs. Stewart stood up anxiously. "I'll go check." I noticed Mrs. Parker glancing at the landline phone in the dining room after Mrs. Stewart left. A red light was blinking, indicating a missed call. So the show was about to begin. Sure enough, the phone rang. Mrs. Parker happened to pass by and naturally picked up Stewart residence. A worried female voice came through. "Is Mrs. Stewart available?" This is Victoria Reed." I watched this scene coldly. It was exactly the same script as my previous life. "Miss Reed." Mrs. Parker feigned surprise. "One moment, I'll get Mrs. Stewart." She hurried toward the kitchen. I knew what would happen next. Victoria would tell Mrs. Stewart she saw Alex and me behaving inappropriately in the car, claiming she was only calling out of concern for the Stewart family's reputation. "Alex," I suddenly spoke, "do you trust me?" "Of course," he answered without hesitation. "Then, will you help me put on a show?" He looked at me curiously. "What kind of show?" I leaned close to his ear and whispered quickly. Alex's expression grew amused. "I see. Well then, let's see who's really putting on an act." Soon, Mrs. Stewart returned with Mrs. Parker. Mrs. Stewart's expression was strange. "Alex, Grace, there's a phone call." I stood up. "No need to answer it, Mrs. Stewart." "I know who it is." "You do?" Mrs. Stewart looked surprised. I gave a slight smile. "It's Victoria Reed, isn't it? She's going to tell you that she saw Alex and me in the car." How did you know?" Mrs. Stewart stared at me in surprise. Mrs. Parker also showed signs of panic. "Because," I said calmly, "this is all a setup." I took out my phone and pulled up a file. "Mrs. Stewart, please take a look at this." Mrs. Stewart took the phone, her expression growing increasingly troubled. It was the documentation from my investigation. Mrs. Parker's real identity, records of her communications with the Reed family, and those photos of Victoria and James Wilson. Mrs. Stewart looked at the photos in disbelief. "This Victoria Reed is actually with James Wilson." "Mom," Alex spoke up, his voice cold. "Do you remember what happened to grandfather 5 years ago?" Mrs. Stewart's face darkened further. That incident 5 years ago had nearly cost her father-in-law's life. "Actually, Victoria and James Wilson have known each other for a long time," I added. "This phone call is just their attempt to cause trouble between us." Mrs. Stewart whirled around to face Mrs. Parker. "You're working for the Reeds?" Mrs. Parker turned pale, unable to speak. Just then the phone rang again. This time, I pressed the speakerphone button. "Mrs. Stewart," Victoria's anxious voice came through. "I'm not sure if I should say this, but today I saw Miss Chen and Alex in the car. It was rather inappropriate." "I'm only thinking of the Stewart family's reputation." "Miss Reed," I cut her off. "Are you really thinking of the Stewart family or of James Wilson's interests?" The line went silent. "Speaking of which," I continued, "how long have you been planning this scheme with the tech company in Boston? Were you planning to have Alex invest and then bankrupt the company? Just like 5 years ago." "You." Victoria's voice suddenly turned sharp. "Grace, how do you know?" She caught herself, but it was too late. Alex laughed coldly. "So you were involved in what happened to my grandfather 5 years ago?" I didn't." Victoria clearly panicked. I pressed the end call button. "That's enough." Turning to Mrs. Stewart, I said, "Mrs. Stewart, you've treated me like a daughter all these years. I couldn't stand by and watch someone try to harm the Stewart family." Mrs. Stewart's eyes welled up with tears as she hugged me. "My dear girl, thank goodness for you." She turned to Mrs. Parker and said sternly, "You, pack your things and leave the Stewart house immediately." Mrs. Parker stumbled out. "Grace," Mrs. Stewart sat down with me, "about the sapphire necklace." "Wait, Mom." Alex suddenly knelt on one knee, pulling out a red velvet box from his suit jacket. "Grace Chen, will you marry me?" I froze. Images from this life and my previous one overlapped in my mind. At this moment in my previous life, Alex had also been kneeling in this dining room, but in front of Victoria. "I've had this ring for many years," Alex said softly. "Since that year when you were 18, I knew it would only ever be you." I fell into his arms. "Yes, Alex. Yes." Mrs. Stewart wiped away happy tears as she fastened the sapphire necklace around my neck. Just then my phone vibrated. My investigator had sent a message. Miss Chen, latest update from Boston. Wilson has arrived, and he's scheduled to meet Victoria tomorrow. The location is… I looked at the message and silently turned off my phone. There was no need to play word games with Victoria anymore. I would defeat her through actions. Grace, what's wrong? Alex noticed my expression. About Boston tomorrow? I looked up at him. I'm coming with you. Mrs. Stewart looked concerned. Leaving so soon? What about the engagement party? Mom, Alex took my hand. We'll plan the engagement party as soon as we return from Boston. But first, I need to deal with some complications. I knew what he meant. It was time to put an end to James Wilson and Victoria's schemes. After dinner, Alex drove me home. On the way, he suddenly said, Grace, do you know why I waited so long to propose? I shook my head. Because I was waiting for the perfect moment. He looked at me tenderly. I wanted to do it in front of my mother, to let the whole world know that you're the only one I'll ever protect. I leaned on his shoulder, my mind already on the upcoming events in Boston. A battle was inevitable there. But this time, I would eliminate these threats in my own way. At home, I opened my laptop and pulled up the files on Novatech. As Stewart Enterprises Legal Director, I knew better than anyone how to plan this out. Alex sent me a message. Got all the Boston documents ready. We'll show you in tomorrow's meeting. There are a lot of suspicious points about that company. Let's look into it together. I replied, see you tomorrow. Setting down my phone, I walked to the window. The city lights twinkled in the darkness, but my mind was crystal clear. Victoria, did you think you could use the same tricks in Boston? You're wrong. This time will be your and James Wilson's final act. And I would do it properly, using legal and business means to make you face the consequences of your actions. Alex, this time I'll protect you in the most righteous way possible. Lying in bed, I touched the sapphire necklace and smiled. In this life, I finally wore it, and I'd earned it in the most honorable way. Tomorrow, let's resolve all our grudges, fair and square. The next morning, we boarded our flight to Boston. On the plane, Alex explained the details about Novatech's situation. Novatech, supposedly developing AI chips, but actually… Alex opened a folder. Their financial statements from the past 2 years are highly suspicious. I took the documents and examined them carefully. They're inflating their profits, and… I pointed to a specific page. These R&D expenditures don't make sense. Tell me more. Alex looked interested. By industry standards, AI chip R&D should account for at least 40% of total expenditure. But Novatech only shows 15%, with the rest categorized under miscellaneous expenses. I frowned. Where did that money really go? Alex's eyes lit up. So what you're suggesting is… Let me handle this project, I said confidently. As legal director, I'll make sure they have nowhere to hide within the legal framework. Alex affectionately tapped my nose. My fiancé is truly remarkable. When we arrived in Boston, we went straight to Novatech General Manager Tom Carter was already waiting. Mr. Stewart. Carter's face was full of flattery. Our chairman, Mr. Wilson, insisted we must ensure your complete satisfaction. I noticed his eyes shifting nervously as he spoke. Mr. Carter, I pulled out a document. I'm Stewart Enterprises Legal Director. This is our preliminary cooperation agreement. Please review it. Carter took the document, his expression changing. I had deliberately included numerous legal clauses that directly targeted their vulnerabilities. Isn't this a bit too stringent? He wiped his brow. Is there a problem? I smiled. If your company's operations are legitimate, these are all standard requirements. Carter stammered, unable to respond. Just then, the conference room door opened. James Wilson strode in. Alex, long time no see. He wore a calculating smile, but his gaze fell on me. And this is… my fiancé and Stewart Enterprises Legal Director. Alex wrapped his arm around my waist, his tone brooking no argument. Wilson's eyes showed a flash of surprise before quickly recovering. Congratulations, Alex. However, he picked up the cooperation agreement. Perhaps we should reconsider some of these terms? Mr. Wilson, I asked calmly, which terms do you feel need reconsidering? Are you concerned these clauses might expose certain issues? Wilson's smile froze. Just then, my assistant sent a message. Ms. Chen, we've traced Novatech's actual R&D spending flow. They've been transferring funds to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and the actual controller of that company is… Reading the message, I allowed myself a slight smile. Wilson, your game is over. Mr. Wilson, do you know why I specifically emphasized the audit clauses for fund flows in the contract? I calmly opened the file, pointing to a particular section. Because we discovered something interesting. Wilson's expression subtly changed, but he quickly regained his composure. Oh? What did Miss Chen discover? In the past 2 years, 85% of Novatech's R&D funds were transferred to a company called Future Innovation. I pulled out an investigation report. This company is registered in the Cayman Islands, appearing to be a standard offshore company. But interestingly, I paused, watching Wilson's face gradually change. The shareholder of this company shares the same proxy agent as another investment company you registered last year, Mr. Wilson. The atmosphere in the conference room suddenly grew tense. Alex let out a cold laugh. Wilson, were you planning to have us invest, then siphon off the funds through this method? You misunderstand, Mr. Stewart. Wilson tried to maintain his composure. This is just normal business cooperation. Is it? I interrupted him. Then let's look at this. I opened my laptop and displayed a corporate structure chart. On the surface, Novatech appears to be under your control, Mr. Wilson, but through layers of proxy ownership, the ultimate beneficiary is actually a British company called Bright Future. And this company. Enough. Wilson suddenly stood up. Miss Chen, you're overstepping your bounds. I'm Stewart Enterprises Legal Director. This is precisely my responsibility. I met his gaze calmly. Moreover, as the future Mrs. Stewart, I have an obligation to protect the company's interests. You. Wilson's face turned ugly. Alex suddenly spoke up. Wilson, did you think I wouldn't find out about your relationship with Victoria Reed? Are you trying the same old tricks? Wilson paused, then sneered. Alex, you're too full of yourself. But since you mentioned Victoria, no need to mention her. I pushed a document across to Wilson. This is our complete investigation report on Novatech, including evidence of all illegal operations. Mr. Wilson, do you think the SEC would be interested in this? The color drained from Wilson's face. You have two choices. Alex stood up, his voice ice cold. Either withdraw completely from Novatech and stop all schemes against Stewart Enterprises, or we send this report to the SEC. You too. Wilson gritted his teeth. Oh, and I added, we also have records of all your business dealings with Miss Reed. If this evidence were to become public. Wilson stared at us for a long time before finally collapsing into his chair. What do you want? I smiled victoriously. It's simple, operate legally and follow the rules. What do you think, Mr. Wilson? At that moment, I knew we had one. As for Victoria, let her understand what a legitimate victory looks like. On the flight back, Alex held my hand the entire time. Grace, he suddenly said, you know something? You were absolutely stunning in that conference room today. I turned to look at him. What do you mean? That confident, strategic demeanor, he gazed at me adoringly, made me incredibly proud. I leaned against his shoulder. I was just doing my job as legal director. No, Alex said seriously, you did much more than that. If you hadn't discovered these issues in advance, I might have fallen into the same trap as 5 years ago. I felt a warmth in my heart. Yes, in this life, I would protect him using my professional expertise, not by hiding in the shadows and suffering in silence. After we landed, Alex's phone rang. It was his mother. Mom. Alex answered the phone, listened for a while, then his expression turned curious. I see, we'll head home right away. What happened? I asked. James Wilson contacted my mom, saying he's withdrawing from all projects related to Stewart Enterprises. Alex smiled. Looks like he's truly scared. I nodded. Businessmen fear reputation damage most. With the evidence in our hands, he has no choice but to back down. When we arrived at the Stewart mansion, Mrs. Stewart was waiting for us. As soon as she saw us, she excitedly said, Grace, you won't believe what just happened. The Reed family. Mom, I interrupted her. None of that matters anymore. Now, shouldn't we be planning the engagement party? Mrs. Stewart paused, then broke into a broad smile. Yes. The engagement party is what's important. I've already checked the dates, thinking of having it at the beginning of next month. Watching Mrs. Stewart enthusiastically discuss engagement details, I felt completely at peace. In this life, I would stand proudly beside Alex, using my abilities to shield him from harm, not like my previous life where I could only watch helplessly as others hurt him. Later that night at home, Alex texted, Darling, shall we go ring shopping tomorrow? Just then, my assistant's message came through. Ms. Chen, James Wilson has started processing Novatech's ownership transfer. Also, Miss Reed appears to be leaving Boston. Looking at this message, I smiled and replied to Alex, see you tomorrow. Setting down my phone, I walked to the window. The stars twinkled in the night sky, just like the bright future ahead for Alex and me. Victoria, you lost. Not to scheming, but to legitimate capability. In this life, I'll protect my happiness in the most honorable way. The world outside remained chaotic, but my heart was perfectly calm, because I knew that as long as we stayed on the right path, nothing could threaten Alex's and my love. Tomorrow, we'll go choose our engagement rings. This time, I'll proudly wear the ring that rightfully belongs to me. A soft morning breeze rustled through the trees as Alex arrived to pick me up. "Cancelled all your meetings for today?" I smiled, looking at him in his impeccable suit. "Of course," he playfully touched my nose. "Choosing rings is important enough to clear the schedule for." The Cartier staff was already waiting for us. The counter displayed various diamond rings, but Alex's attention was drawn to a simple platinum design. "This one," he picked up the ring, "elegant and understated, just like you." I looked at the perfect clarity diamond, feeling touched. In my previous life, Victoria had spent a whole month choosing, finally settling on the most expensive and elaborate design. "Do you like it?" Alex asked softly. I nodded. "I love it because you chose it." He smiled and slipped it onto my finger. "From now on, this is your mark of belonging." Just as we were about to leave, the sales associate suddenly said, "Mr. Stewart, your limited edition order has arrived." I looked at Alex questioningly. "Wedding bands," he whispered in my ear. "I ordered them 2 months ago." I froze. 2 months ago? Yes, his eyes filled with tenderness. "Actually, I'd been waiting for the right moment to confess to you. You just beat me to it." My eyes suddenly welled up with tears. So it wasn't just me protecting this love, he had been preparing for our future too. Leaving the mall, the sun was shining brightly. Alex suddenly said, "Meet my business partners next week?" "Why suddenly?" "You're my future wife and Stewart Enterprises Legal Director," he said seriously. "I want everyone to know that you're not just Mrs. Stewart, but also my most trusted partner." I understood his intention. In this life, I wasn't just the woman hiding behind him. I was his equal partner who could walk beside him. "By the way," he continued, "yesterday James Wilson sent over a contract. He's offering to transfer his riverside property in Greenwich to us." I raised an eyebrow. "Making amends?" "Probably afraid of our evidence," Alex smirked. "But it's a good property, perfect for building our home." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're quite opportunistic." "Why not?" He pulled me close. "Making the best of a bad situation. Besides, our future home should be in the best location." Looking at his confident profile, I felt a sense of déjà vu. At this point in my previous life, he was being deceived by Victoria's facade, starting to distance himself from everyone. But this life, what are you thinking about? Alex noticed my distraction. I shook my head. "Just thinking about our future." "Silly," he kissed my forehead. "Every day of our future will be better than today." Yes, in this life, we would walk forward righteously together. No schemes, no conspiracies, just the purest love and shared effort. On the way back to the office, my assistant messaged, "Ms. Chen, Wilson Group has started restructuring, apparently preparing to exit the New York market." Reading the message, I smiled slightly. What needed to end had ended, and what needed to begin was just starting. This time, I would use my own abilities to walk proudly into the future with Alex.